You got any instructions up? You ruined it.
Here you go.
No, he really doesn't have to.
Take a look,
What
if
page?
you would. Well, for right now, let's look on page 421.
Going backwards.
Page 421 in your book. Let's take a look at this process once again.
That's not gonna work for the camera, bro. She can't see.
Hold on.
Again.
Bro, we gotta finish that.
Take a look at this.
Darwin's theory of natural selection describes how, if given enough time, a population that would result in the appearance of a new species. The theory of natural selection describes 4 principles that explain how this can occur: variation, heritability, overproduction, and reproduction. Variation is the principle that explains how individuals in a population differ from one another. Heritability is the principle that explains how variations are inherited from parents. Overproduction is the principle that explains how populations produce more offspring than can survive. Reproductive advantage is the principle that explains that some variations allow the organism that possesses them to have more offspring than the organism that does not possess them.
Oh, okay.
Wait, what was that?
That was your essay, basically.
I didn't. If we said every one of those words, we make 100.
Look on page 421.
Another word.
You have your book? It shows at the top of 421 a bunch of flowers of different heights. Tall flowers tend to have kids with tall flowers. Short flowers tend to have kids with short flowers. They don't really have kids. They lay down seeds and the seeds grow up and then there.
That's so much better.
So there's an overproduction, meaning that there's too many offspring born that can't survive. And in the example on page 421, the tall flowers do poorly for whatever reason, and the short flowers survive. So the population ends up being.
Sign burnt it.
If you did every one of those words on that page, you'd only have 121 words in your essay.
So that's not the whole thing. You have to also,
Right.
and if you read the question, it asks you to give evidence, which is the evidence of evolution includes fossil evidence, homologous structures, vestigial structures, embryology you can talk about DNA evidence, biogeography, you can talk about mimicry and camouflage. We went on and on with this stuff. So, today, we're going to finish up this chapter, and I don't think we'll finish that video, but we'll get into it.
Liger.
How do we tell what a species is? If 2 organisms are different species, how do we know that? Well, if you look on page 437,
They're huge. Yeah, they're like the size of like a white book. Yeah, they probably are.
it talks about isolating mechanisms.
Yeah, they're like the line.
Okay, my turn. My turn. Yes.
Aren't ligers really big?
Taylor had his hand up.
What
Yes.
if you got 2 ligers and kept breeding them?
They're
They can't breed. I'm going to get into that.
Dang.
Okay?
I have a question.
Yes.
Aren't ligers like really big?
I don't know.
Are they bigger than a lion?
I don't think so.
They're bigger than a white tiger.
Okay.
White tiger.
It looks like them.
Ready? The next section gets into isolating mechanisms. What we call isolating mechanisms. How is it that we can get one species and from a single species we get 2 species? We call this speciation, and it has to do with isolating mechanisms. And hold on, I'll talk about this stuff. Oh, here we go.
Oh.
Ah, shoot, I don't have the video here.
fish eater.
Hold on, I have to go to the AP Biologies for a moment.
Bro, you know that dinosaur in the first Jurassic Park that, like, kills the guy from Seinfeld?
Oh, the little one?
Yeah.
That, like, spits acid?
Yeah. It reminds me of a peacock so much.
The thing that goes like...
You know what I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah, it's like.
You want some cheesy poops too? Yeah,
Oh, what?
Sorry?
What was that, bro? What's South Park?
Okay. Okay, here's where it is.
I need that. Right there.
Yes, here we go. Please don't make that squeaking noise. Okay, here we have a population of frogs. And the frogs are these 2 frogs are of the same species. One frog represents a whole population. Okay? And what we're going to see here is an isolating event where the population becomes split.
When populations become geographically isolated, individuals can no longer mate. Gradually, natural selection produces gene pools so distinct that individuals can no longer produce fertile offspring, even if mating did occur.
So what happened here was we started with a population of frogs that are the same species. And they were isolated from one another. This river came between the 2 populations. Now, a lot of people go, well, frog can swim. That's pretty stupid. They just could swim across the river, so they really aren't isolated. But let's imagine that, I mean, this could be 2 continents. You know from continental drift that continents can separate and move way far away, and that could be a big ocean. And you could have frogs separated by thousands of miles. They truly would be isolated. So imagine this happens over millions and millions of years, and they're on separate continents. Then this frog and this frog are no longer exchanging genes with one another. We say that they're isolated from one another. And we call this a pre-zygotic isolation. Pre-zygotic, meaning before the zygote. The zygote is the fertilized egg. So this is something that keeps the 2 from mating with one another, the male from fertilizing the egg of the female. There's never a mating between the 2 populations. And so if the conditions change on one side and they don't change on the other, for instance, like the wimpox, it becomes colder, or something about this continent is different, say rainfall is different, then the species on this could change. And in this example, they go from green to spotted, and the green ones die out, and only the spotted ones survive. So
How can they
now,
mate though? How can they have babies if they can't
there are
mate?
other frogs with them. Yes, this doesn't just mean one frog on this side. It represents a whole population.
Oh.
Okay, so there's thousands of frogs over here of that species. So this species gradually changes, over time, again, this could be millions of years, but what we've done was we've gone from one green frog species to two species where we have green frogs and we have spotted frogs, I'll call them.
Let's call them Christmas frogs.
And if the spotted frogs are so different from the green frogs that they'll no longer mate with one another even if you mixed them up, there you got a new species.
Yeah.
And that's how new species comes about, through isolating mechanisms. It doesn't always have to happen where the isolating mechanism is something like a river, or mountains are often isolating mechanisms, where two plates collide and mountains come up and separate two populations. That often happens. There can also be isolating mechanisms that develop with species that are not divided. For instance, here's a frog, 5 different species of frogs. Wood frogs, leopard frogs, pickerel frogs, green frogs, and bullfrogs. It's thought that they all came from one species of frog a long time ago. And imagine there's a species of frog a long time ago that likes to mate around May 1st. And it's a whole bunch of frogs, same population, they're all one species, and they all like to mate around May 1st. Now imagine there's a mutation in one of them. And for some reason, because of its DNA, it doesn't want to mate on May 1st. It wants to mate on July 1st. So on May 1st, the weather changes and all the frogs are doing their calls. Brah, brah, brah. That's a frog mating call. And the frogs are all, oh yeah, I like that, and they're into it, and they're mating around May 1st. But there's this one frog over there that doesn't want to mate at that time. It's going to wait till July 1st. What's going to happen around July 1st? That frog wants to mate. Well, if there's no other frog with that mutation, that frog will just die and not survive. But if there's another frog with the same mutation, and it also wants to mate on July 1st, guess what? Those two frogs will mate with one another. And they will form, they'll have a bunch of babies, and all those babies will probably want to mate somewhere around July 1st too, unless one of them has a mutation. But you can see you've got a whole population of frogs now, after a while, that all want to mate around July 1st, and their gene pool remains separate from the frogs that want to mate around May 1st, because those two never mate, because they're different mating times. And you can build up some differences between those frogs and the ones who want to mate around May 1st. You can build up differences in the gene pools through mutations, and you can end up with a whole new species. They are isolated too. They're not isolated by a river or mountains, they're isolated by time. We call that temporal isolation. And it keeps the gene pool separate. It's just like a river in between them, except it's time in between when they want to mate. And so we think that's how these 5 species of frogs came about, by mutations that caused them to want to mate at different times and separated the gene pools.
Mr. Wallace?
Yes?
Did you know that babies born in May are significantly heavier than babies born in May?
I'm a baby born in May.
Me too, bro. Yeah.
We're
My
heavier.
sister was born in May. She's 5 pounds.
I was 10 pounds.
Yeah, just know that.
Yeah.
I was 10.
I don't know. It's just
A
all.
little bit heavy, I guess.
You looking massive.
Bro, go hear the cheesy poops again.
You're like massive.
Oh, I just turned it off.
Real pound.
Sorry.
Massive.
It's right there.
Oh.
It's right there.
Okay, let me go back to this now.
Oh, hello. Karma. Karma.
What is that?
Deadline.
Why is it doing
I
that?
hate deadline. Me too. Deadline is the death of me.
Go to slide 32.
I did. I has to do.
Stinks.
That was like 10 minutes ago. I was like,
Yeah, I know, it lingered up
Weird.
I don't like the way this slowly changes.
that's one of the tries
What's
Okay, so let's talk about this liger. The liger has what we call post-zygotic isolating The liger is a cross. It's a cross between a lion and a tiger. If a lion and a tiger mate, they give birth to a liger, and a liger is sterile. A liger can't have babies.
Why?
There's something to do with its chromosome number is off. So it doesn't have the right number of chromosomes to produce sperm and egg that can survive and form a new form a baby. So ligers are sterile. The same case goes with zebroids.
What?
If you mate a zebra with a horse, you end up with a zebroid,
I thought they were called
which is
horses.
sterile.
I've never heard of this before.
Now you know.
Why are they called zebras?
Yes, Taylor.
Has there ever been like a sterile human?
Yeah, there's
Yeah.
mutations that make you sterile.
There are
yeah.
women that can't have babies.
But it's a little bit different than what we're talking about here. If you mate a horse and a donkey, you end up with a mule. The mule is sterile too. So what this means is the horse and the donkey are different species. If two organisms cannot have a baby that's sterile, cannot have a baby that can have kids, then they're separate species. And we call this post-zygotic isolating mechanisms. Horses and donkeys can mate and have kids, but since the kids are sterile, that's post-zygotic. Post means after. After the zygote forms, it can't have kids. So that's isolating mechanism between the horses and donkeys' gene pools. The donkeys and horses can't mate because their kids will be sterile. They can't mate with one another, so that makes them separate species. And that happens from time to time.
So if I want to make
Here is a couple of squirrels separated by a barrier, the Grand Canyon. The Abert squirrel is on one side of the Grand Canyon. The Kaibab squirrel is on the other side. It's thought that the two were once one population before the river came through and dug the canyon out and separated those populations. So these two squirrels evolved from the same common ancestor millions of years ago.
There's a bunch of squirrels down in the Grand Canyon.
Okay, I don't know which one is
Yeah,
which.
there are
There are tons.
billions.
I already talked about
I
the
held one.
frogs.
I fed one peanuts.
So what happens is, if this process continues, please listen. If this process continues, we start with one species that separates into two. Each of those species could divide into two. And continuing on, you can see what we call an evolutionary tree. And an evolutionary tree is when you start with a single species and it branches out to many others. It's like the branches of a tree. And we call this branching out, going from one species to many, we call it adaptive radiation. And it's one of the side effects of evolution. If evolution occurs, you see this adaptive radiation where we start with one frog and we end up with many. Whenever you see an evolutionary tree, there will often be ends. We start with, this is a long time ago at the bottom, and this is present day at the top. And if a branch ends before it makes to the top, that means it's extinct. That one went extinct, see? It didn't make it all the way to present times. Maybe this one went extinct right there. So you often see that on evolutionary trees, branches that end, and we call those extinctions. But if this is true, if evolution does work this way, then in the fossil record, we should see a lot of species recently and less species the further back you go in time. Which is exactly what we find. We find there's a lot more species now than there used to be. And the number of species has been increasing over time. And then there'll be, sometimes there'll be a major extinction that wipes out a whole bunch of them, and then we see another adaptive radiation.
So more species are being made right now?
That's correct, except that we are in a mass extinction right now. you know that?
No.
We're in the middle of a mass extinction even bigger than the one that killed the dinosaurs. You know what it's caused by?
What?
Humans. Humans have cut down so many trees and done so much hunting and fishing and that type of thing that we think we've reduced the number of species in the last 100 years on Earth. Estimates go anywhere between 70 and 90%. And 75% of the species died out when the dinosaurs were killed. So we're on a mass extinction right now about equal to the one that killed the dinosaurs. And it's just because of humans cutting down so much stuff. It's not as violent as the catastrophe that killed the dinosaurs, but it's just as effective. So here's 6 types of fish we think all came from the same fish. Evidence points towards that.
Yeah, but trees grow back.
Yeah, and they did after the meteor hit. But there are organisms, a lot of different species that have gone extinct because they didn't have places to live.
Yeah.
And we know that's happening at a really high rate right now. Look at the adaptive radiation for finches. You see this adaptive radiation in almost every type of species. This is the one for finches of the Galapagos. All of these finches came from the same common ancestor, Tiaris, that is found on the mainland South America. And it must have come to the islands long time ago and inhabited all the islands, and depending on which Galapagos island it was on, it changed a little bit to suit the food that was found on the island, and so then you get all these different species. This is a adaptive radiation showing all the different dinosaurs and bird groups that came from one single common ancestor about 290 million years ago. And we're not going to get into each of these. We do that later. We'll study each of these groups later in the year. We'll study fish, we'll study amphibians, we'll study reptiles, we'll study birds. But here's one of all the fish that came from a single common ancestor. Again, we'll study these later. Here's a different one, different tree showing fish on the left and some amphibians on the right. Here's a tree showing the evolution of elephants and the extinct mastodons and mammoths that have gone extinct, and only these elephants have made it to present day. African and Asian elephants.
Pachyderm.
This shows the evolution. This is a tree showing the evolution of the modern killer whale and all of its steps going back. Did you know it evolved from a creature that walked on land?
It looks like a tiger.
Yeah, it was a carnivore. And look at the evolution of the modern horse. It started from a very small horse-like creature called the Hyracotheria about 60 million years ago. And all these types have gone extinct. Only the modern horse made it to today. This shows the evolution of a bunch of different types of birds. This is the evolutionary tree of the Hawaiian honey creepers. And this is a little video showing the evolutionary adaptations of the cat family, if you like cats.
I hate cats.
This just takes a minute.
Horses species should have evolved according to laws of evolution, which state that major evolutionary events occur when there is a sudden and dramatic environmental change. Those who cannot adapt to the new world die. But some animals will have a chance mutation that may help them survive in the new environment. These survivors will form the basis of a new species. Slowly, these new species will start to exploit all the different ecological niches in the new environment. Gradually, these creatures will adapt to these different niches, and slowly one new species will evolve into two.
We can see how this happens where something new arises, there's a new adaptation, a slightly better way of getting hold of food, of avoiding a predator, of walking across a landscape, and that then gives that population an advantage. It spreads out into new areas. Where you had one population, you now have two. Where you have one species, you now have two species.
This is how evolutionary family trees develop. Two species split to form separate branches. These branches can split again, and then again. And so a whole host of related species will develop.
So what is happening is that each time you're getting proliferation of branches, you're getting divergence taking place, and with that divergence comes what we think of as an adaptive radiation.
Adaptive radiation is one of the fundamental truths of evolution. There are signs of it in virtually every type of animal that has ever lived. Like the cat family.
The cats are a beautiful example of an adaptive radiation because you can see what they all have in common. They have in common the fact that they are hunters and stalking hunters, and they have diversified from a common ancestor into everything from lions, which are very large, to wild cats and lynxes that can live in cold environments, to indeed domestic cats today. So they're a beautiful example of this, the shape of evolution.
Adaptive radiation has given cats a classic evolutionary family tree. Lots of related species coming from lots of different branches. It means the cat family tree has a distinctly bushy appearance. And tracing any individual creature's line of ancestors is a complex business.
Okay, so, to wrap this up, we've got all these evolutionary trees, all these divisions, adaptive radiations forming all the different groups. There's the cat family tree, and the bird family tree, and the reptiles, and the fish, and the amphibians. And what we think is that they all connect to one another. They all branch off from one another if you go further back in time. And you keep going back and back further in time, you get all the way back to the first organisms. We think that all the living things of today have all branched off, are all related to the first organisms that appeared on Earth. The single-celled prokaryotic bacteria that we know existed about 4 billion years ago. And they have just branched off, and over 4 billion years, they formed all the different species. There's a lot of evidence for that. We share a lot of things with the trees out there. We're all made of cells. The cells have phospholipid membranes. The cells use ribosomes and DNA and mitochondrions for doing their things. All the same chemicals, all the same atoms. So we think that's because every living thing branched off from these first cells. And it's kind of interesting. If you follow from the first cells all the way to today, let's say we followed the tree up, followed the branches up, and looked at the organisms from the first cells all the way up to modern humans, which are one of these many millions of branches is us. And you follow that up, you can kind of see the organism changing over time. And a beautiful video was made by my favorite scientist, his name's Carl Sagan, showing the changes that happened leading all the way up to us. And human evolution is next chapter. But this is it. This is probably my favorite video I've ever shown. It's all the way, it was made back in the 70s, but I've never seen it done this well except in this one. Take a look here.
Things that looks like a piece of fruit.
That's Carl Sagan. He's dead now.
Without the tools
My
of
favorite
science,
scientist.
the
He's an
machinery
astronomer.
would be invisible.
But he made this show called Cosmos.
Now, let's take a closer look at who our ancestors were. A simple chemical circumstance led to one of the great moments in the history of our planet. There were many kinds of molecules in the primordial soup. Some were attracted to water on one side and repelled by it on the other. This drove them together into a tiny enclosed spherical shell, like a soap bubble, which protected the interior. Within the bubble, the ancestors of DNA found a home, and the first cell arose. It took hundreds of millions of years for tiny plants to evolve, giving off oxygen. But that branch didn't lead to us. Bacteria that could breathe oxygen took over 1 billion more years to evolve. From a naked nucleus, a cell developed with a nucleus inside. Some of these amoeba-like forms led eventually to plants. Others produced colonies, with inside and outside cells performing different functions. Becoming a polyp
Tucker, watch the
attached to
video.
the ocean floor, filtering food from the water, and evolving little tentacles to direct food into a primitive mouth. This humble ancestor of ours also led to spiny-skinned, armored animals with internal organs, including our cousin, the starfish. But we don't come from starfish. About 550 million years ago, filter feeders evolved gill slits, which were more efficient at straining food particles from the water. One evolutionary branch led to acorn worms. Another led to a creature which swam freely in the larval stage, but as an adult was still firmly anchored to the ocean floor. Some became living hollow tubes, but others retained the larval forms throughout the life cycle and became free-swimming adults with something like a backbone. Our ancestors now, 500 million years ago, were jawless, filter-feeding fish, a little like lampreys. Gradually, those tiny fish evolved eyes and jaws. Fish then began to eat one another. If you could swim fast, you survived. If you had jaws to eat with, you could now use your gills to breathe the oxygen in the water. This is the way modern fish arose. During the summer, some swamps and lakes dried up, so some fish evolved a primitive lung to breathe air until the rains came. Their brains were getting bigger. If the rains didn't come, it was handy to be able to pull yourself along to the next swamp. That was a very important adaptation. The first amphibians evolved, still with a fish-like tail. Amphibians, like fish, laid their eggs in water where they were easily eaten. But then a splendid new invention came along, the hard-shelled egg laid on the land where there were as yet no predators. Reptiles and turtles. Go back to those days. Many of the reptiles hatched on land never returned to the waters. Some became the dinosaurs. One line of dinosaurs developed feathers useful for short flights. Today, the only living descendants of the dinosaurs are the birds.
What about the alligators?
The great dinosaurs evolved along another branch. Some were the largest flesh eaters ever to walk the land. But 65 million years ago, they all mysteriously perished. Meanwhile, the forerunners of the dinosaurs were also evolving in a different direction. Small, scurrying creatures, with the young growing inside the mother's body. After the extinction of the dinosaurs, many different forms developed.
Is that a seal?
The young were very immature at birth. In the marsupials, the wombat, for example, and in the mammals. The young had to be taught how to survive. The brain grew larger still. Something like a shrew was the ancestor of all the mammals. One line took to the trees, developing dexterity, stereovision, larger brains, and a curiosity about their environment. Some became baboons. But that's not the line to us. Apes and humans have a recent common ancestor. Bone for bone, muscle for muscle, molecule for molecule. There are almost no important differences between apes and humans. Unlike the chimpanzee, our ancestors walked upright, freeing their hands to poke and fix and experiment. We got smarter. We began to talk. Many collateral branches of the human family became extinct in the last few million years. We, with our brains in our hands, are the survivors. There's an unbroken thread that stretches from those first cells to us. Let's look at it again, compressing 4 billion years of evolution into 40 seconds. Those are some of the things that molecules do, given 4 billion years of evolution.
That's my favorite video so far.
That was good. Now let's see the Simpsons version.
Yeah!
Why are people still forming from monkeys?
Oh, we're going to go over that next chapter, human evolution.
Watch it again.
You forgot the milk.
One more time, bro.
No, no more time.
No more time.
So, is it time to cut the video off?
Well, yeah, you can cut that off.
Say bye!
Peace out.